don't really have too much to show that I've done today, but I've got a few things to talk about. Good news all around so far, anyway. The first thing is I took the car up to the car certifier for his first look at it. He's never done a vintage car before, so he's never been through the process of getting a car like this through. And the way we have to do it, there's a special set of rules that I have to follow. So this car is defined as a scratch-built historic replica, which means it basically has to be pretty much indistinguishable or at least recognizable as a car of the period. So that's why I'm always very careful about doing it the period way, using period parts, that kind of thing. You can do a few minor little tweaks and bits and pieces like modern radiator cores or, probably you could use a modern fuel cell if you wanted. But generally the car has to be a period correct replica. So that's what I'm doing. He did point out to me that in order for him to be able to get the car through that process, it actually has to be identified by the Vintage Car Club as that. And I've gone through a similar process with my Austin 7, and I'm going to have to do it for this as well. But to do that process, the car has to be finished. I think I've mentioned this before, or it at least has to look finished. So it needs a body, it needs to have the trim, the seats, the windscreen, the guards, all of that stuff, so that you can get that form from the Vintage Car Club. Which means we can't do the bit of the process around the certifying without that. So to get the car through, you have to build the whole thing and kind of hope for the best, really. So he did say to me, well, that's up to me to be sure that I can get that documentation from the Vintage Car Club. He's happy to go through it and do it all, but he said, it could be an awful waste of time and money if you can't get that bit of paper at the end to say, yes, it is a historic replica, then the route we're going down won't work. So I think we should be able to do it. Like I say, I've done it for my Austin 7. I have emailed the Vintage Car Club just to clarify, yes, that is exactly how the process is meant to work, because it is very unclear. But I haven't had a reply from them. So regardless, I'm going to finish the car. I told the certifier I was going to build the car anyway, so he had a look at it. We've started the process. He took some photos. He had a look at a few things, and he said, yep, he thinks we can definitely do it, get it through. He seemed pretty happy with everything and said, go ahead, do the rest. So that's what I'm going to do. He did point out a few things that I've had to change already. So a historic scratch-built replica like this still has to go through what's called the low volume certification process. And cars going through that are normally, you normally work to a fairly strict set of rules that are set out in a sort of technical handbook that explains all the rules to you. The manual is actually very good. It goes into most things in pretty clear detail. And if you're unsure, you talk to the certifiers, and if they're unsure, they talk to LVVTA. So he did say one thing that I would have to do on this car. There are a certain number of things that are effectively non-negotiable around the standards. For a period correct car, you can get away with quite a lot of things that you couldn't if you were building a modern new car, which is how I get away with it being vintage, because this is how it was built. But the things that are non-negotiable are the brakes. It can be the original braking system, but still some of the rules apply to the brakes, and I'll get to that in a sec. It has to have collapsible steering, which a pre-war car like this has effectively built in, because the steering box is well behind the front axle, and in this case almost behind the engine. And you've got the tiller arm there, which is what Riley called it, which effectively makes it all collapsible anyway. So that's fine. Any glass has to be proper spec glass. I think it has to be laminated glass, and I think it has to be a recognized type of glass. Now that gets interesting because it's only considered a windscreen if you're looking through it. If you're looking over it, it's more like a wind deflector, and the rules are a little bit different. So I think you can get away with sort of perspex screens and things like that, but I'll look at that when I get there. You do need a minimum of lap belts. And this is where I'm going to have trouble with the Austin 7 because there just isn't anywhere to put lap belts. But the Riley should be fine because I can bolt directly to the chassis rail and also to that cross member there. You do need doubler plates and things like that. But I think the certifier is happy to help me with that part when I get that far. The belts have to be recognized as well. You can't just get any old belts. But I do want to try and get hold of something that at least looks kind of period race car type belts, not modern plastic belts. So I'll have to see what you can get that will meet the requirements there. And I think the other one was lights. I can't remember. There is something else that you have to be able to meet the standards, but the lights and the actual brakes in terms of the braking performance aren't too bad. Even in a vintage car, they can still keep up to the modern braking standards because I don't think they've actually updated the rules for years. So a car like this can easily stop in the required distance. But the thing he did say that I had to change because they wouldn't like it was my brake pedal. So the rules basically say with brake pedals, and this is one of the non-negotiables because it's one of the safety issues, so I can understand where they're coming from. If it's an original cast or forged brake pedal, you cannot modify it. You have to use it how it is. So you can't cut it or drill it or file it or bend it or anything, basically. You can, however, make your own pedal out of mild steel. It has to be at least 8mm thick or thicker, or if it's not steel, it has to be like an equivalent strength to 8mm thick steel. And it has to be one piece, and that's where this one would fail. So this is the one I got from the UK. When I say one piece, the pedal pad doesn't count. Basically, they're just talking about the lever that operates the brake mechanism. And this has kind of been done in several pieces. So this wouldn't work. So what I've ended up having to do is I used a piece of 10mm mild steel cut from a piece of box section, and I made a new pedal basically with a big circular bit here, and it has a separate boss that goes through. You are allowed to weld the boss to the pedal, but the rules basically state the idea is even if that weld fails, the pedal will still operate because it's a single piece of steel. So you could imagine if this weld here failed, this would still be captive and it would still work. So basically I had to make up another one. And I was thinking about getting it sort of CNC or plasma or water jet cut, but it was easy enough to do with an angle grinder in the end. And it's basically pretty much exactly the same as the other one. It's 10mm thick steel, so it's easily thick enough. My welds down there aren't the prettiest, but the boss I made that I machined for it, I actually machined it so one side was slightly smaller diameter than the other, and I made it a press fit into that steel. So being a press fit with my ugly welds, that's never going to come apart. And even if it did, the pedal will still work. The brake would still actually function. So hopefully that's okay. The other thing I did is my magneto came back. There was nothing wrong with it. It was just user error. So I went through and set it up really carefully again. I have found, though, it's not all user error. When it's in the most retarded position like this, I don't really get a spark. So I think it's because this has been modified. What I found is I did actually have to move it round to a little way along, and then it sparks fine. And I was able to test that on the car without the distributor cap, because this has a safety gap so that you can run it without the leads and you can see the spark jumping. So I was actually able to see, yep, in that position, no spark. That's why it wouldn't start. Wasn't even coughing. So it did have to be there. Now, when I set it up the first time and got it running, I'd set that position to be statically timed to top dead center. So all I had to do this time was figure out where the spark actually was fine, started on the lever, and then I set that to be top dead center, and that now works perfectly. I was able to run the engine slightly longer. This is my fuel system, and I've discovered that gravity feed isn't enough. to get past the float needles in the carburetors. So I have to actually fill it up and then blow into the end of the tube, and that blows enough fuel in to fill the float bowls, and then I was able to run the engine again. And I ran it for just a little bit longer, still, 20 seconds, something like that. Just long enough to play with the advance lever, and that actually makes a massive difference to how well the engine runs. You can hear it runs far better with advance. And I was also able to run it long enough to check the oil pressure. That gauge goes to 75 psi, and it pegged the gauge. So oil pressure is good. There is oil appearing in places, so things will need tightening down a little bit, the covers and things like that. So my oil-free, leak-free engine didn't stay leak-free for long, but that's all right. I have filled the diff, which is also leaking just a little bit. I've nipped up the bolts on that, so hopefully that stopped that. Somebody did mention to me, one thing I might want to look at doing is adding a breather. There's no breather on this as it is. Apparently they have been known to pressurize and shoot oil down the ends of the axle, which then goes straight onto your brakes. So the way you can make a breather on this is you get a slightly longer bolt here with a little banjo on it, and you drill the bolt out basically, and then you have a little brass banjo and just a little copper pipe that sort of comes down, runs down here somewhere, and that just provides a little bit of breathing for the rear axle. What else have I done? So yes, this now runs and starts quite nicely. I may still try to make a starting handle and see if it starts on the handle, but with the electric starter there, that's not urgent. I have also been looking a bit more at the woodworking that I'm going to need to do. The first thing I'm actually going to do is make another radiator surround. So you might remember that was my first attempt, which came out a little rough and slightly too narrow. The dimensions aren't quite right. I did buy more steel. I dug a sheet of that out today and cut it in half because it's too hard to manage by myself if it's a whole sheet. So I will start by making the new radiator shell, because in terms of the body, that kind of gives you where the front of the body is anyway, because the line has to go across the bonnet to the scuttle and then back. So I want that in place. I have started looking at the plans and drawing up the body shape. I do want doors on it, and of course I do have that original door, which gives me some of the curvature of the panels. But I think what I'm going to have to do is, even if the body's quite curved, the back will have to be a little bit straighter. I can't get too much curve there because it would get in the way of the shock absorbers. Although looking at it now, there's actually quite a bit of space there. So that shouldn't be too hard. I did get a new bandsaw blade, and I've been watching quite a few videos on YouTube about how you set up the bandsaw and how you use it and that kind of thing. I replaced the bearings. I machined on the mill the faces of the blade guide blocks, and I've set this all up correctly. You set it up so that the back of the gullet on the teeth is running on the center of the wheel, and that's basically how you're supposed to set that up. And I've set up the table. Like I say, I bought a new blade, which has made a big difference. And you do a test cut in one direction, and then if you flip that round and can feed it back in to the slot from the back, your table's perpendicular to the blade. So that works nicely now. I did just go with a wood blade, not like a bimetal one that I could do steel on, because I have got other ways to cut steel. And I think that was everything on the car today. I did also get a book. So I think I'd mentioned in one of my recent films about the lack of books and things on on building timber frame cars. And somebody kindly left a comment for me giving me the name of a book. And I thought, I bet that's going to be difficult to find. So I did a search on Trade Me. Trade Me is our New Zealand equivalent of eBay. So eBay never really took off in New Zealand because Trade Me was already here. So there is no eBay New Zealand. But we do have Trade Me, which is kind of the same. And I thought, I'll just have a quick search on there. And amazingly enough, somebody had listed a copy of that book just that day, not long before. So I just snapped it up. And that book goes into timber frame, steel tube frame, I believe. I haven't even had a chance to read it yet. But I think that should be really useful. I've also been looking at quite a few different woodworking videos and bits and pieces. And I have been buying a few more tools. Nothing serious so far. So just some marking out tools, some squares and a marking knife. I'd already bought a sharpening kit, so I've sharpened my chisels and my plane, and that's made a big difference. On the advice of a friend who knows about this stuff, I was looking at getting a little tenon saw, but he suggested one of the Japanese pull saws. I can't remember the name of it. It's the one with the stiff spine to it. So I've ordered one of those to play with, and I'm going to make up I think it's called a shooting board, which is what you can use to make sure the ends of your bits of wood are square. You use it with a plane. So I've been looking at a lot of films on YouTube around woodworking as well. Just simple things. One thing I may end up getting is a decent linisher with a circular disc and also a belt disc. I've actually wanted one for a long time. This was just a little one I made with a scrap motor I had, and it's tiny. So there's no power behind this. It's okay for smaller things, but I have thought for a long time I'd really like to get a proper one. So I'll wait until there's a sale on, I think, and then invest in one of those. And then I think I've probably got enough to start. The other thing I did was I was in at work last week. They're starting to get us to go back into the office now, and there's a timber merchant that's literally 5-10 minute walk from work. So I went up to see them, and they do supply ash, rough sawn ash planks. They're either 25, 40 or 50 millimeter thick, different widths, but sort of 200, 250 wide or wider, and various lengths. And the price, it's not cheap, but it's not as bad as I thought. So at least I know I can get the right timber. That's about it. So my little pile of tools. That was just a stand for the TV I was making. So brake pedal fixed. I do still need to start thinking about some of the other fittings that go on the chassis on this. So of course there's the under tray. And I think I'd mentioned that it can be like a full under tray. But if you do it all in one piece, it makes getting to bits of the car very, very awkward. So for example, getting to the brakes or the pedals or anything like that would be a real nightmare. So I may look at doing it in multiple pieces and having it removable somehow. Not sure exactly the best way to do that, but that's something I'll have to figure out. And I do need to make they're sort of axle straps. So they're just, I don't know, probably 5mm, 6mm thick steel U-shaped straps that go over here to limit the upward motion of the axle, and they just bolt to the chassis, of course. And then radiator shell, cooling system. Once I get a cooling system sorted out, I can run the engine for a bit longer. And then if I fitted the actual brake cable, there's no reason I couldn't drive this. Might have to rig up some sort of temporary seat, but it would certainly be ready to take around the garden a couple of times. And funnily enough, that's what the certifier said to me. He said that's the next thing he'd do is would get a seat on it and get it so you could drive it around. But it's coming along. It's getting there. I'm really pleased that having spoken to the certifier, I'll have to go back and see him a few times, I'm sure, but I feel a lot happier that he sees a way forward with it and thinks, yeah, we can get this through. So that's good.